Hi, welcome to the Amphibian Press podcast. This is Sarah Boris, and joining me today is J.A. Pitts, who's an urban fantasy author. So thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for asking. It was great.
So I've read almost all of your work, but for our listeners who are new to you, would you give just like a quick overview of your Sarah Beauhal series?
Yeah, so it's an urban fantasy series set in Seattle, Pacific Northwest area. Mm-hmm. And I love reading tons and tons of urban fantasy. And I decided I wanted to do something that wasn't based on vampires or werewolves. So I wrote the series based in Norse mythology, which to me is far more interesting than something that's been rehashed a lot. My main character, Sara, is a 27-year-old young woman who's a blacksmith and a lesbian. And that seems to be the focal point for pretty much any question I ever get asked, being a not any of the above. Right, yeah. How much research did I do for that character? So to me, it's really cool, and it explores not only how the world is versus how you perceive the world, mm-hmm. but what the reality of the people around you go through as well. So that's pretty much it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely. I definitely identified with her the moment I picked up the book. So much so, actually, that I think it took me until like the second book to actually like look you up, and I assumed that you were a female author. And then when I saw like John, I'm like, oh wow, like he did a really good job. So that's sort of a
thank you
flip flop of the norm there.
Yeah, my favorite fan mail does come to Miss Pitts, so don't look it up and realize. So that's fine.
So did you mentioned that you get a lot of questions about the research that you've done. As far mm-hmm. as blacksmithing, which is sort of a more unusual vocation for main characters, have you done any smithing yourself, or was that sort of?
Well, so this started out as a short story, okay. And I was invited to an anthology about swords, and so it's called Swordplay, out from Daw about 10 years ago. Anyway, I was an anthology. You're in competition with a lot of other writers for what few slots they have, and so it had to be about a magic sword. And I knew that they were going to get 10 stories about Excalibur, right? So that's why I went with Rand sword. But I also knew that most of the main characters of those stories were going to be warriors, and so I wanted to do something that was a maker, somebody who builds things, not just destroys things. So that's how I came on the blacksmith, the person who actually makes or fixes the sword. And then everything kind of flowed from there. I knew Sarah was going to be the main character from the very beginning, and then having her be a blacksmith and setting it in modern time just all kind of fit with the way I like to write. So, to me, it was. I was dead on, by the way. So they had 4 stories with Excalibur, but they only had one other story with a blacksmith in it, and so I got picked for the anthology.
That's awesome. Nice. And
I love the parallels
there.
Sorry.
I love the parallels there between being a creator and the blacksmithing, and then also Katie's singing and being a bard, and how there are parallels there with writing and craftsmanship. That always spoke to me too as an author as well. So.
Yeah, I have a couple of friends who write their own music and play music, and my daughter started playing the guitar at like 7 years old, and so we got her lessons. She was really interested in that, so it's always been very important to me. Music is very important. I write to music. Mm-hmm. When I first got on the thing, I had to turn off my Pandora because I was writing, and I always listen to music. It's very powerful for me. So, I knew I was going to have a character in there that dealt with music and was the bard character. I used to play EverQuest back in the million years ago, and I loved playing the bard character. And if you play Dungeons & Dragons or any of those other role-playing games, the bard is never the character anybody particularly wants to play because they're always an auxiliary character. So for me, making Katie basically a bard or a skald was was really critical because I wanted her to show her creative side and how she can augment the relationship both not just creatively but power-wise with Sarah as the story progresses. Mm-hmm. If you keep her as equal instead of just a silly sidekick. So
yeah, there's definitely that back and forth, the yin and yang thing going on. Mm-hmm. So you mentioned online a lot that your mother and your grandmother and all these women sort of came together to help raise you, and that sense of community and like chosen family is definitely something as a reader I noticed is very strong in your work. Was that intentional, or was that more like an organic development, do you think?
Well, this is nature versus nurture, right? Mm-hmm. So my dad was killed when I was 2. He was in a car accident. And so there was always women around. My mom's 2 best friends were always there. My grandmother, who gave me my first science fiction book to read when I was like 8, mm-hmm. She was awesome. She never learned to drive. She always worked at the Woolworths, and you had to call it that, Woolworths. And dropped out of school at 13. But she loved to read and she loved science fiction. She would sneak me up late at night to watch Star Trek, and so it was just really helped hone my love of genre. And so that was always permeated my life. So when I write, and a significant amount of my writing evolves around women characters and the sense of family and what that means and how it influences not only the characters' actions, but how the world, swirls around them. Mm-hmm. So because of how I was raised and the things that I lived through, I think that significantly influences the writing, but I very much want to talk about the family you make versus the family you're born into, because I know a lot of people, especially in the LGBTQ community, who are not with their families as much. The families they're born to don't always embrace them, and they have to find a community that's supportive of them. And that's what I wanted for this book, would be a community that they could come together and find people who they could love and be encouraged with, despite whatever else was going on in the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's definitely very true, especially now, I think, with the online community becoming so much more a part of our lives, for good and bad reasons. I do think that a lot of people who are in more marginalized communities have found this other community or this auxiliary community online. And it's nice to see people being able to find it in person as well, because there is a sense of connection that I think the internet does not give us. But yeah, it's really lovely to see that. So you mentioned sort of like the genre of urban fantasy. And now it's changed a lot in the past decade, I think, just as a reader from what I've noticed. And I think we're still seeing that grow and boom. But what do you think has made it so appealing? I mean, you touched on it a little bit just then. And where do you think you're going to see it go in the next few years?
It depends on the voice of the author a lot, whether I'm going to enjoy it or not. But I do see this as a genre that's going to continue to evolve. And as we evolve, like, for example, one of my favorite authors is Carrie Vaughn. And she had the Kitty Pryde Werewolf series, and I absolutely loved it. It was one of those books that when it came out, I would stop whatever project I'm on and consume that book in a day or so, and then go back to whatever I was working on. And I like how the authors like Carrie are showing us a version of the world that's better than what we have, and or how we can overcome the things that aren't good. One of the appeals of urban fantasy, of course, is you can find yourself in it much more easily than you can with traditional high fantasy, which I love. I mean, the Rings and all that is fantastic for me. But being able to find your place in the story to me is easier if it's got a coffee shop that you can go to, or I did an interview when Black Blade Blues first came out. With Issaquah newspaper, because I mentioned Issaquah, which is a local town here. I mentioned book, and one of the reporters called me up and did an interview, and he says, I read your book and it's really fantastic, and I absolutely love that Mexican restaurant you mentioned at the end of the book. And I don't give it a name. All I say is a Mexican restaurant in a town called Everett. But this journalist knew exactly what restaurant that was, right? They found themselves and things that were important to them in that portion of the story, which I thought was fascinating. And that's where I think the strength of urban fantasy lies is, yes, you've got the fantasy element, and yes, it's a life that is far different from how we are normally going to live our lives. I don't know personally any dragons, right? But that I could find myself in a lot of the minutia, in a lot of the setting, and how people interact, I think makes it far more appealing to readers than maybe some of the other genres.
Yeah, I can definitely see that for sure. Now, about a year ago, you finished up book 7 of the Cleric's Journal. Can you tell us a little bit about that project? Because that's sort of a different from Sarah Beauhal.
Yeah, so Sarah, it's Beauhal, by the way. So Sarah, I don't know, it's one of those things, you read it and you don't pronounce it. Tor, who I dearly love, Tor Publishing, and my editor is fantastic, but they decided to drop the series. And I was pretty devastated by that. It took them a year longer. You contractually, they say we'll respond in a certain amount of time, and they said let's give it a little more time to see how book 3 does. Blah blah blah. So it took about a year longer than normal to make a decision. So in that time, I'd written the next 2 books, just because I love the series. And when they dropped it, I got pretty depressed. And a lot of authors go through this, not all of them, but a lot of authors go through the imposter syndrome thing. And it just, it says, oh, right, you're not good enough. This was a fluke, blah, blah, blah. We call it head monkeys where I live. Anyway, so I hadn't written in like 2 years, very little, a little bit of short story work, but really nothing major, a project. And one day I was sitting around, and my wife, who knows me better than anybody else, said, if you just go write something, you'd probably feel better. And so I decided I wanted to write something that I enjoyed, regardless of whether anybody else liked it. And I've been playing Dungeons and Dragons since the first books came out in like 77 or something, early days before there were hardbacks, and I just love it. I absolutely love that that game because of the creativity and the imagination and all that. So I decided. And I was watching the first season of MASH, and so the story is the main character in the book, who's called Useless Lump because it's what he's been called his whole life, is writing. It's an epistolary, right? So he's writing a journal entry every day to Father Mulcahy, which is I got that from the MASH series, but it's really the head of his order. And it's the adventure of this very, very naive, sheltered 19-year-old young man who does not understand pretty much anything about the world. And I wanted to be able to explore lots of things in this that you don't typically see in high fantasy or second world fantasy, like sexuality and gender and race relations. Why do orcs have to be bad, and things like that. And so it just started out as an exercise for me to write again, and I wanted to force myself to a commitment on it. So I actually wrote an average of 1,000 words a day for almost 16 months and posted it every day on my blog. So I would read it, I would write it, I would read it to my wife just so I could read it out loud and get some kind of coherence to it. And then I would just post it. No major edits, no continuity read, just post it every single day. And I broke it up into seasons because I was watching MASH. So I broke it up into, which is essentially 7 books right now. And I got a lot of feedback. A lot of people hit my website, tons and tons of email from people that just said, especially when I quit writing it, why aren't you writing this? I want to read this every morning, get up and have my coffee. And the biggest reason I stopped writing it was because I needed to get on the back of the other projects. I have a day job, which is pretty intense. And it waxes and wanes. Sometimes I'll go and work 50 hours a week and not even think about writing. But now I'm getting back to some more of a logical self-care area to get my hours down so I can write more. But anyway, I bundled the first book, the first section into a book and sent it off to my agent who read it, who gave me really excellent feedback and likes the voice and likes the characters, but needs it to have a novel shape. Right. And still be epistolary, but it needs to have an arc and an ending and all that silly nonsense that novels are required to have. So I started doing that, and at the same time, I had sent her Sarah 5, the next book for Sara, which I had done a pretty significant rewrite on, and so she had both of those. And 4 for Sara had been published by Wordfire Press, Kevin J. Anderson, and they did a nice job, and the cover's good, and the quality of the book looks good. And so when I was talking to Kevin, he's like, "Hey, when you're ready for book 5, we'd be happy to go ahead and publish it. Just tell us when you're ready." So I had to juggle the 2 of those projects. So I decided I would do the Sara stuff first because it had a publisher who was willing to publish it.
Right.
And a fan base that constantly sends me emails wanting to know why the book isn't done yet, which is fair. It's been a couple of years. So that's what I'm working on right now. I plan to go back to the Cleric after I wrap this last pass on the Sara book and get it back to my agent. I'll go back to Cleric book 1, and it's interesting in my project for Sara 5, I actually trashed the ending. This is my 9th pass through this novel. I completely gutted the ending and threw it out, and I'm rewriting it to be something different, which I think is significantly stronger. And the audience, I think, will appreciate it a lot more than what I had done. And by doing this, it showed me pretty much what I need to do to the Cleric book to fix the ending on that book by the exercise I've gone through on Sara 5. Sara 5, by the way, which is the working title is The Rainbow Brigade. So
I was hoping I'd get the
I'll be getting The Rainbow Brigade. And this is let's say I met there's a group of young folks out of Bellingham, Washington, and young, they're probably in the late 20s or 30s now, but when I met them 10 years ago, they were all pretty much fresh out of college, and they call themselves the Hamsters because they're from Bellingham. And I met them at a Clarion West party, and after knowing them for a little while, they were asking me about my books or whatever and wanted to be in the book. And so this is the book where I put all of them in the book where I destroyed Bellingham on their behalf. But it was, do you want to be in the book? Do you want to live or die? And what weapon would you like to use in the big battle at the end, whether you live or die? So that was always fun. And another author friend of mine who lives up there is Spencer Ellsworth, who's a musician as well. And I put his band in the book because why not? So that's fun. This is my homage to a bunch of the friends I've made.
That's so much fun.
And I get to
I did something similar. It was a prize for a contest for one of my book releases, and one person won the chance to be written in as a character. And it started out as like a small supporting character, and now he's become a lot more of a character than I realized, and there's a whole subplot around him. But it's so much fun to do that. I feel like it's a good way to stretch your writing brain. It's a little different from just a prompt.
Yeah, I really enjoy that group of characters, and they have a pretty prominent role in this book. And my goal after this book for Sara is to write 2 novellas before I write the 6th novel.
That was my next question. Is 5 it, or is there more?
um, so I've already gotten a rough outline for book 6, and it's called Sins of the Father. And this is the one where every single email I get that says, how come I don't know more about Sarah's family?
Right.
This goes into more Sarah's family side of the conversation and what's going on with them, which is pretty intriguing. Mm-hmm. So that's that next book. But I just have tons and tons of ideas for it. But it's a series that is not it's not going to break out probably at this point. It's the fan base it has, who it has. So I really got to get the Cleric out there. And then once I get done with the Cleric series, it's 7 books. I haven't decided if I'm going to wrap it at book 8 or book 10. And I'm toying with what I'm going to do on that one. I absolutely know the end of the Cleric series. I also know the end of the Sarah series. I know how I'm going to end that. So, I had a friend of mine who died recently.
I'm sorry.
Thanks. She came to me like 3 weeks before she died. I know she knew. She was 71. And she says, can you please tell me how this series ends? And it was, and I said, how about y'all let you read it when we're there? But so I do have the full plan. I know how it's going to end, and what happens to Sarah and everybody. So
that's powerful.
Yeah,
so your work can be found digital and paperback, correct?
Yes. Yeah. And audio.
In audio. Oh, awesome. And that's all at japitts.net. And we'll put links to everything in the show notes. But where else can people find you online? I mean, obviously you have a substantial blog on your site.
Well, I'm on Facebook. I've got a personal page, which is normal rambling stuff, and then I've got an author page as well. And I have to go look it up anymore. I don't remember it. And I'm on Twitter at jpittsauthor, and I can email you those links.
Yeah, for sure.
I may have put those. Anyway, I'll send them to you if you don't already have them. And there's a local, if you're in the Seattle or Portland area, with Brenda Cooper, who's another author up here, who's wonderful. She and I have the Seattle version of a SIFWA Science Fiction Fantasy Writers of America quarterly event where we do author readings. And so I'm there every quarter for that. If you just wanted to come out and meet us, it's a really cool event. We always get authors to come in, 3 authors read. We do a Q&A with the authors, and then a bookseller shows up through the whole thing. And it's at an Irish pub, so there's food and alcohol the whole time. Yeah. And then so like a Tuesday night, which is coming up 2 weeks, I think. On Tuesday night, we do it in Kirkland, Washington. And then on the Thursday night, they go down and do it in Portland. So that's a fun event. And so we're involved with that as well. And, just Facebook is probably the best at this point of getting a hold of me.
Mm-hmm. And do you have any events coming up next in 2019? What year are we?
Yeah. Well, it depends on the election coming up. I'm not sure yet. I haven't got a schedule for 2019 other than there's a really cool convention in Missoula, Montana called MissCon. It's misscon.org, and I've been going to that for 5 or 6 years. Very well-run convention. It's not super large. Mm-hmm. I'll tell you how big it is. There were 5 pros there the first year I went, including George Martin.
Oh, wow.
And then, and by pro definition, you got to be very careful. There was a ton of people who write, and a ton of people self-publish and whatever. But the group of I was considered to be part of the group with the big writers, mm-hmm. which is always me. And so I got to have over a 4-day weekend. I had like 8 meals with George Martin, which was really cool.
Yeah, picked his brain, I'm sure.
So that was, yeah. It's just like, hey, let's go get breakfast. Okay, sure. I'm happy to have breakfast with you. I mean, it was never just me and him, but it was 3 or 4 of us. But it's just really cool. And it's a great convention. It's small enough to where you don't feel overwhelmed by the crowds, and it's big enough. It gets like Jim Butcher's been there, and Pat Rothfuss has been there, and Patty Briggs, and so there's a lot of authors who show up. C.J. Cherry. So anyways, I definitely will be there. In 2019, that's Memorial Day weekend. Mm-hmm. And I need to update my website. I don't have any other conventions I'm going to this year. I decided not to go to one of the local cons this year. I'm trying to get more writing done in what free time I have instead of going to conventions right now. Once I get a couple more books in the pipeline in the publishing side of it, I'll go again. Probably go to Emerald City Comic Con, at least for one day in the spring. Good chance I'll go to Norwest Con over Easter weekend. Kind of up in the air from that. I'll update my website. Go west now. If you're, I know New Hampshire. I don't do. I got to tour your neck of the woods a little bit. A few years ago, my daughter was looking for colleges, and she looked at Bryn Mawr and Colby College and a bunch of stuff, and 2 in Maine, and so anyway, so we toured all around the side of the country in the summer, not the winter, which we told her, so you can go to college in Maine, but there's going to be a lot of snow. Yeah. So I haven't done a lot of the East Coast conventions, but the West Coast has a bunch of really, really nice conventions. So you should definitely look into it. And they're very kind to publishers as well. That's nice. So, yes. It's really cool.
All right. Well, I think that's just about our time. But definitely for our viewers and listeners, make sure if you haven't already checked out the Sarah Beauhal series, I'll say it right this time. Definitely go and do that. It's one of my absolute favorites. I badgered my local bookstore every time a new one came out to order it. So if you haven't, definitely go and do that. And also stay tuned for everything that's coming out new for J.A. Pitts. So this has been the Amphibian Press podcast, and I'm Sarah Morris. And again, J.A. Pitts, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.